What's up, YouTube? Want to have a chat with you guys today about production knives and the steel, heat treats, the whole 9 yards. Okay, something I see a whole lot on Reddit, YouTube comments, Instagram is with the knife tips being broken. Perfect example would be, CBRX stabbing it in the tree and then lateral loading the tip. And then, having a failure and you'll hear what? It's poor heat treat. Okay, that's just not true. Geometry is what determines if that tip's gonna snap off or not. I've got quality heat treats here. Gonzo actually does pretty good heat treats. All these up here, except for this, have solid heat treats and are run at good hardness. This one here, heat treat, not bad, but it's way too soft. But the point of these knives, they're a good selection of different geometries that are going to show what I'm talking about. You take this knife right here. It's got a nice fine tip on it. And you stab it into wood and you laterally load that tip, you're going to snap this knife. Even though this 440, or I'm sorry, I believe these are D2. Yes, this is D2. You're going to snap that tip off because of the geometry. Not because it's got a great or poor heat. It doesn't matter. This tip. Now here you go, you got some meat behind it. This tip right here is going to stand up better, and this is in 440. That tip right there is going to hold up better than this tip. This tip right here, D2 again, you've got a pretty fine tip, but you actually got some meat there. So that tip is going to hold up much better than this Nitro V right here, because look how fine that tip is. If I stab both of these knives right here, let's do it this way. If I stab both of these knives, let's see if I can even get this one to stick without. Okay. And I apply lateral load to that, which one of those do you think are going to snap? Even though here we have 440, here we have Nitro V. Nitro V is a tougher steel. Finer grain structure, but I mean there's a perfect example. Look at it. Now watch this one. See how much quicker that one stops vibrating? That one's still going. That's just because that geometry is so thin. There's very little steel at that tip. It doesn't matter that this is a tougher steel. That's irrelevant. It is geometry. Another example. Now let's go with knives that we know have good solid heat treats. Let's go with this Mini Jimbo and a Sage 5. Here you go. They're both S30V. You can see you've got some meat at that tip. Not a whole lot, but you got some meat there. Now look at that tip. What do you think is going to happen if I stick this in this table, even that deep, and apply lateral force on it? I don't care if that was 3V. Guess what? I'm going to break that tip because it's geometry. It's geometry all day long. Now, if it's a poor heat treat, where you're going to see that, if it's run at a too low of a Rockwell and the heat treat itself is bad, you have a bad microstructure, yeah, you're probably going to get some bending. It'll bend before it snaps. And I'm not saying that if it, the better quality the heat treat, that the less likely for that tip to snap. Yeah, that is true. a great heat treat versus a poor heat treat, where you have, proper grain structure versus grain growth, etc. Yes, that's going to make a difference to some extent, but not much. It's geometry. If you have meat at the tip, you're not going to tip the knife. If you have no material at the tip, you got a real small, thin, fine tip, that tip's going to break. I don't care what steel it is. I don't care how good the heat treat is. It's just the way it is. It is geometry. Another thing, and this one really annoys me. You'll see all day long people saying, and even I do it from time to time myself, but when I'm saying it, I'm more when it comes out of my mouth, I say with a good heat treat, I'm saying quality heat treat plus hardness at a optimal level. But most people, when they're saying it, you'll hear them say, oh yeah, the edge retention is poor because it has a bad heat treat. That is not true. When it comes to edge retention, it is a matter of steel composition, carbide level, carbide type, and hardness. Plain and simple. Edge stability factors in as well, but for the most part, hardness controls your edge retention. If we're talking about the same steels. If the geometry is the same, both pieces of S30V, and this is 61.5 Rockwell, and this is 60 Rockwell, guess what? Even if the heat treat was better, if this one just happened to be in a better place in the oven and just has a dead perfect heat treat on it, on let's say the Sage, but after temper it's at 60.5, and this one, the heat treat's not so perfect, but after temper at 61.5, this one's still going to be the one that cuts the longest, because it's a factor of hardness and steel composition. Now, of course, we got to take geometry out of that, because geometry is what matters more than anything anyways. But we're speaking, if we had two Sage 5s or whatever, same steel, same everything, hardness is what matters. With D2, for example, you get a lot of crappy China D2. Well, that really shows its face when you're sharpening. Poor heat treats sharpen poorly. It doesn't like to deburr. It doesn't come up crisp. It feels nasty during steel removal. But if you got D2 with a crappy heat treat at 62 and D2 at 58, but with a really good heat treat, no retained low retained austenite, just a good heat treat, the one at 62 is going to outcut the one at 58. Even if the one at 62 has a very poor heat treat, has some grain growth, it's just the way it is. It's a function of carbide volume, steel composition, and Rockwell. Now there are some, we can go into edge stability. That's got to be factored into, but I'm just speaking in general because I see it so much that something needs to be said about it. If you go look at Alex Outdoors 55, he did a video on it where he took, 3 knives he made, one with is truly about as shitty of a heat treat as you could possibly do on it. One with a perfect heat treat, one with a decent heat treat. They're all at the same Rockwell, and edge retention wise, there was absolutely no difference between the 3. And that is because same composition, Same geometry. Edge retention is determined by Rockwell. The harder the steel, the longer it's going to cut. This especially holds true in production knives. In custom knives, where you're working with really thin geometries, 5-6 thousandths of an inch behind the edge, super thin hollow grinds, we're not discussing that. I mean, it holds true there too, to some extent, mostly, but there is some differences there. But we're talking in production knives. In production knives, it is 100% composition and Rockwell. And it's why when I'm testing knives, doing cut test on them, and say I have some D2 from some China company that has good, it's 15 thousandths of an inch behind the edge, your standard 3mm stock thickness, tall flat grind, and say I've sharpened it, I can tell it's soft. But I cut test that, and it doesn't line up nowhere near what your typical soft D2 lines up as. I'm not going to say, oh, this is just really poorly heat treated steel. That tells you right there, almost guaranteed, that is not the composition that they say it is. Because if it's 58, 59 Rockwell, and you have, I've tested other D2 at 58, 59 Rockwell, where, known hardnesses, been tested, and if it doesn't test within, I can't speak, within say 10%, 10 to 15%, that it's a different composition. Now, they could have been told that it is D2. There's a lot of, in the manufacturing of the steel, there is China steel. It's not nearly as tightly controlled as really high quality steels. And I'm not saying China doesn't make good steel. They can. But your typical China D2s, they can be pretty much all over the place. Stuff that they call D2 is not D2. Even though the manufacturer says it is. Not the knife manufacturer, but the steel manufacturer. Just because, it's not nearly as tightly controlled as a quality steel. One reason why they get it so cheap. But, yeah, and that goes with any steel. It could be 8CR. You take Spyderco's 8CR from, that San Remu makes for them, and it's consistently right at 60 Rockwell. You go and buy some Kershaw 8CR, and it's typically around 57, 58 Rockwell. And guess what? Spyderco is going to outcut it because it's 2 to 3 points harder. So it's not, when you're watching those channels and you see snap the tip. Oh, this is a terrible heat treat. Yeah, that's bullshit. Stop buying into it. The YouTubers that are telling you that, they don't know what they're talking about. Because that's just not what it is. It is 100% geometry. Is the geometry able to handle the load that is placed on that steel at this depth in this material, and that's what determines whether it breaks or not. Not the heat treat. Now, I'm not saying that grain growth and everything doesn't affect. It does. But when we're talking about that fine of a tip with that little bit of steel being stabbed into a tree or stabbed into whatever and pried on, it's going to snap, whether perfect heat treat or not or the shittiest heat, it doesn't matter. It's geometry. Now, if you're saying, "Hey, I'm sharpening this steel and it's just turning into, you know, a foil burr on me, and it won't come loose, and the steel doesn't want to cut. It smears across the diamonds, you know, across the diamond plate. It just feels like it's I'm sharpening Play-Doh." That's poor heat treat, lots of retained austenite, probably ran very, very soft. That's yes, that is 100%. How do I put this? The sharpening experience of a knife is very much determined by quality of heat treat. Again, geometry. Nice thin grind, sharpened so nicely. But we're gonna take that out. On the stones, heat treat is where you really can tell the quality of it. If you have even on a low end steel composition, if you have a very good heat treat and the steel's ran at optimal range of hardness, that steel is going to sharpen very, very nicely. That's a perfect example. If I sat down and put this on the stones, and this is not done very well. This steel is not done very well. It's soft, you know, very, very gummy burr formation. Just this steel is not done very good. Or this very, very well done piece of S30V. This will sharpen so much nicer, so much easier than that piece of D2. No comparison, actually. It will sharpen so much more nicely. The whole experience will be far, far nicer. It's where when you hear, "Oh, D2's hard to sharpen." No. This is pretty good D2. It's done pretty well. Ran at a reasonable hardness. Sharpens up beautifully. Poorly done piece of D2. Sharpens like shit. Simple as that. I'd rather sharpen a nicely done piece of S110V than I would a piece of poorly done 5CR. Now, if, you know, say you got a perfect, you know, custom heat treat piece of 8CR, for example, well, I'd rather sharpen that than I would, you know, a poorly done piece of crewware, for example. Even though most people would say, "Oh yeah, that crap steel is going to sharpen terrible," and no. In sharpening, steel composition has a lot to do with it, but heat treat quality and Rockwell is really what determines how nicely a steel sharpens. That's why, you know, you get a piece of custom Magna Cut at 65 Rockwell with nice thin geometry, and it just sharpens so easily, and it comes up so super sticky so quickly. Well, most people would tell you, "Oh, it's 65 Rockwell. That's going to be hard to sharpen." Well, that's bullshit. It's quality heat treat really shows itself on the sharpening stones. That's where it shows itself the most, actually. Edge retention. Don't let people tell you, "Oh, it's a bad heat treat. That's why it has such poor edge retention." Edge retention is steel composition and Rockwell for the most part, keeping geometry out of the equation. That's just the way it is. So next time you hear somebody tell you, "Oh yeah, that D2's got a bad heat treat, and that's why it doesn't perform very well," yeah, it's either not D2 or it's very, very soft.